Blood on the snow is a common sight in the Wind River Range, but survival rarely comes from a loaded Winchester. It comes from the unlikeliest of strangers. This is the true, forgotten account of a shattered mountain man, a desperate runaway, and the frozen morning she took his reins. The winter of 1883 was known to the locals of the Wyoming Territory as the White Death. It was a season that swallowed cattle whole and froze rivers solid, before November even had a chance to turn the calendar page. Deep in the treacherous foothills of the Wind Rivers, miles away from the nearest outpost of South Pass City, Gideon Callahan was a man accustomed to the brutal indifference of nature. Gideon was a trapper, a tracker, and a solitary ghost of the mountains. He knew the ridges and valleys better than he knew the lines on his own calloused hands. But the mountains demand a toll for overconfidence, and on a bitter Tuesday morning they came to collect. It wasn't a bear or a band of hostile raiders that brought the imposing mountain man to his knees. It was a patch of black ice concealed beneath a dusting of fresh snow on a sheer scree slope. Gideon had been tracking a stray elk when his heavy leather boot lost purchase. He tumbled 50 feet down the jagged ravine. The sickening crack that echoed through the silent pine forest wasn't a breaking branch. It was the sound of 3 ribs snapping on his right side, one of them splintering inward, dangerously close to his lung. It took Gideon 14 agonizing hours to crawl and drag himself back to his isolated timber cabin. By the time he breached his front door, his heavy buffalo coat was stained dark with his own blood, and his face was drained of all color, pale as the snowdrifts banking against his windows. The pain was absolute. Every ragged breath he drew felt like a rusty, serrated knife twisting in his chest. He knew the grim reality of his situation. If the internal bleeding didn't drown him from the inside out, the encroaching blizzard would freeze him in his bed. He needed Dr. Amos Whitcomb down in Lander, which meant he needed to ride. Dawn broke with a harsh, blinding glare. The temperature had plummeted to 10 degrees below zero. Gideon, heavily wrapped in wool and clutching his side, staggered out to the small adjoining corral. His breath plumed in the freezing air like locomotive smoke. Waiting for him was Buster, an ill-tempered, massive, dapple-gray Mustang that Gideon had broken himself 2 summers prior. Buster was a reliable mountain horse, but he was skittish, easily spooked by the smell of blood and weakness. Gideon leaned against the rough-hewn fence, his vision swimming with dark spots. He dragged his heavy leather McClellan saddle from the top rail, gritting his teeth as fiery agony flared through his shattered ribcage. He gripped the horn, trying to heave the 50-pound rig onto the Mustang's broad back. Buster snorted, sidestepping away, his hooves crunching loudly in the crusted snow. "Stand still, damn you!" Gideon hissed, the words tasting like copper in his mouth. He lunged forward, trying to throw the saddle over the horse, but his right leg buckled. The blinding white pain radiating from his broken ribs robbed him of his breath. The heavy dental slipped from his trembling hands, crashing into the snow. Gideon fell to his knees, gasping, clutching his right side as a fresh wave of agony threatened to pull him into unconsciousness. He was a man who had survived avalanches and the violent Indian wars. Yet here he was, being defeated by a piece of oiled leather and his own fractured bones. He prepared himself for the cold embrace of the snow, ready to accept that his stubborn independence had finally dug his grave. But the crunch of snow behind him wasn't the sound of his Mustang. "You're going to puncture your own lung if you try to lift that again." Gideon's head snapped up. Through the haze of pain, he instinctively reached for the heavy Colt revolver strapped to his left hip. His numb fingers fumbled with the leather hammer thong, but a booted foot stepped firmly onto his wrist before he could draw. Standing above him, silhouetted against the harsh morning sun, was a woman. She was not a hardened frontier wife, nor a local from the trading post. She wore a heavy men's canvas duster that swallowed her frame, a woolen scarf pulled up to her nose, and a wide-brimmed Stetson pulled low. Her face was smudged with dirt and exhaustion, her lips chapped from the relentless wind. This was Josephine Miller. Josephine was entirely out of place in the unforgiving altitude of the Wind River Range. Less than a week ago, she had been trapped in a lavish, suffocating estate in Cheyenne, betrothed against her will to Horace Caldwell, a ruthless railroad tycoon who collected people like property. She had fled in the dead of night with nothing but the clothes on her back, a stolen horse that had gone lame 2 days ago, and a desperate prayer. She had been wandering aimlessly through the timberline, driven by the smell of wood smoke, expecting to find an abandoned trapper's shack to shelter in before the storm hit. Instead, she found a dying giant in the snow. Gideon looked up at her, his vision blurring. Who are you?" he choked out, his hand still pinned beneath her boot. "Someone who needs a roof," Josephine replied, her voice trembling slightly from the biting cold, but her eyes, a striking, piercing blue, remained entirely resolute. She moved her foot off his wrist. "And from the looks of it, you need a miracle." Josephine didn't wait for Gideon's permission. She turned her attention to the massive dapple-gray Mustang. Buster tossed his head, his ears pinning back flat against his skull. He didn't know this woman, and the scent of human fear and blood in the air made him highly volatile. "Get away from him!" Gideon groaned, trying to push himself up on his left arm. "He's green broke. He'll kick your teeth down your throat." Josephine ignored the mountain man. She didn't march up to the horse. Instead, she lowered her shoulders, adopting a posture of absolute calm. Growing up, before her family lost their ranch in the Panic of '73, she had spent her childhood in the dusty corrals of a Texas horse breeding operation. She knew the language of equines better than the high society manners Caldwell had tried to beat into her. She approached Buster at an angle, avoiding direct eye contact, murmuring in a low, rhythmic cadence. "Easy there, big boy. I know. It's cold, and your master smells like a butcher's floor. Easy now." She reached out, keeping her hand low, allowing the Mustang to catch her scent. Buster flared his nostrils, huffing a cloud of steam, but he didn't pull away when her gloved fingers brushed his thick neck. With practiced, fluid motions that completely belied her exhausted state, Josephine reached down and scooped up the heavy McClellan saddle. She used her knee to prop it up, utilizing leverage rather than raw upper body strength, and smoothly hoisted it over Buster's back. The saddle settled perfectly into place. She ducked under the horse's neck, grabbed the cinch strap, and pulled it taut, tying off a perfect latigo knot in seconds. Gideon watched her from the snow, his jaw tight, with a mixture of awe and bruised pride. It was a deeply humbling sight. He had built his entire life on the foundation that he needed no one. Yet here he was, broken in the dirt, while a runaway city girl took the reins of his life. "There," Josephine said, patting the horse's flank. She turned back to Gideon, extending a gloved hand. "Your mount is ready, mister." "Callahan," Gideon grunted, refusing her hand. He dug his left elbow into the snow, trying to force his massive frame upward. The moment he put weight on his legs, the broken ribs shifted. A sickening, wet, grinding noise emanated from his chest. Gideon's eyes rolled back in his head. The pain was a blinding flash of white light, and then sudden darkness. The giant mountain man collapsed face first into the snowdrifts. When Gideon finally regained consciousness, the agonizing cold of the snow had been replaced by the radiating heat of a cast-iron stove. He was lying on his own cot inside the cabin. His heavy buffalo coat and blood-soaked wool shirt had been cut away. His torso was tightly bound in strips of white linen bedsheets that had been torn into makeshift bandages. The tight binding restricted his breathing, but it kept the splintered bones from shifting and piercing his organs. He groaned, blinking against the dim, smoky light of the cabin. "Drink this," a voice commanded. Josephine stepped into his line of sight. She had discarded her heavy duster and hat. Her dark hair was falling out of its pins, framing a face that was sharp, intelligent, and deeply weary. She held a tin cup of steaming willow bark tea to his lips. "It will help with the inflammation. You have 3 broken ribs. 1 is badly displaced. You're lucky you didn't puncture a lung out there." Gideon swallowed the bitter liquid, wincing. You brought me inside?" he rasped, looking at his own massive frame and then at her slender figure. "How?" "Leverage. And a stubborn refusal to freeze to death," Josephine said dryly, setting the cup down on a nearby crate. "I used the horse to drag you onto a tarp, and then pulled you through the door. You weigh as much as a cast-iron stove, Mr. Callahan." Gideon stared at her, assessing the situation. She had saved his life. By all rights, he should be profusely thanking her. But his instincts, honed by years of surviving the worst of humanity on the frontier, began to prickle. The way she handled the horse, the efficiency with which she bound his ribs, her expensive, albeit ruined, leather riding boots peeking out from beneath her hem. She was running from something, or someone. "Why are you out here?" Gideon asked, his voice rough. "This ain't country for afternoon strolls. You're 50 miles from a telegraph line." Josephine turned her back to him, stoking the fire in the stove. "I got lost," she lied smoothly. "Liar," Gideon said, the single word hanging heavy in the small cabin. Josephine stiffened. She turned around, her expression hardening. But before she could formulate a response, her eyes darted to the small wooden table near the door. While searching for clean linen and medical supplies in Gideon's saddlebags, she had made a horrifying discovery. She walked over to the table and picked up a crumpled piece of yellow telegraph paper, holding it up for Gideon to see. It was a bounty wire. Wanted, Josephine Miller, fugitive from justice, theft of property and breach of contract, $1,000. Reward for her return to Horace Caldwell. Contact Deputy Marshal Thaddeus Boone. Attached to it was a handwritten note, bearing the official seal of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, addressed directly to Gideon Callahan. It read, "Callahan, we know you know the Wind Rivers better than any Indian or outlaw. Track her down. Caldwell will double the bounty if she's brought back breathing." The cabin fell deathly silent. The howling of the wind outside seemed to amplify the sudden, suffocating tension between them. Josephine stared at the man whose life she had just saved. Her hands began to tremble, not from the cold, but from the realization of the fatal mistake she had made. She hadn't stumbled upon a random trapper. She had walked directly into the den of the man hired to hunt her down. Gideon looked at the paper in her hand, then back to her face. He slowly lowered his head back onto the pillow, letting out a long, ragged sigh that rattled in his injured chest. The irony was a bitter pill. "Well?" Gideon whispered, a dark, humorless smirk touching the corner of his mouth. "Ain't this a hell of a hand we've been dealt?" Josephine took a slow step backward toward the heavy wooden door, her eyes darting to the Winchester rifle leaning against the wall. The blizzard had officially trapped them together. A shattered bounty hunter, and his target, locked in a 10-by-10 cabin at the edge of the world. The silence in the cabin was heavier than the snow burying the roof. Josephine's fingers hovered inches from the cold steel of the Winchester rifle leaning against the log wall. Her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. The man bleeding on the cot wasn't just a rugged victim of the mountains. He was the hound slipped from the leash by Horace Caldwell. Gideon watched her eyes dart toward the gun. He let out a low, gravelly chuckle that ended in a sharp wince as his chest spasmed. "You can grab the iron, Miss Miller," Gideon said, his voice a ragged whisper. "But you best check the chamber. I keep the tube full, but the breech is empty. Safety habit. By the time you rack the lever, I could pull the Colt under my pillow and put a hole in you. And frankly, neither of us can afford to clean up the mess." Josephine froze. She looked from the rifle back to the imposing man in the bed. Her hand slowly dropped to her side. "You knew who I was the second you woke up." "I had my suspicions," Gideon admitted. His gray eyes locked onto hers. "Pinkerton sent that wire up to the trading post 3 weeks back. Said a dark-haired society girl stole Caldwell's prized Arabian mare and $3,000 from his safe heading west. The mare going lame, and you showing up in a man's duster. Well, it wasn't hard to put together." "I didn't steal his money," Josephine spat, her voice trembling with sudden fierce anger. "That money was the remaining equity of my father's ranch. The ranch Caldwell stole when he drove my father to a heart attack. He bought the judge, he bought the deed, and then he bought me, to make it all look legitimate to the Cheyenne High Society. I just took back what was mine." Gideon stared at her. The firelight flickered across her face, highlighting the dirt, the exhaustion, and a core of absolute, unbreakable steel. He had tracked outlaws, murderers, and rustlers for years. He knew the look of a guilty soul. The woman standing before him wasn't a thief. She was a survivor. "Doesn't matter what I believe," Gideon muttered, staring at the log ceiling. "Caldwell's got the law and the Pinkertons in his pocket. Deputy Marshal Thaddeus Boone has been scouring the basin for a week with a hired gun named Josiah Flint. Flint is a ghost, a tracker almost as good as me. They'll find you." "Not if the snow covers my tracks," Josephine said, stepping away from the rifle. She walked back to the stove, throwing another piece of split pine into the firebox. "And not if you're dead." Gideon smiled weakly. "A fair point. But here's the reality of the situation, Josephine. You're 50 miles from South Pass. The White Death is howling out there. If you walk out that door, you'll freeze solid before you make it 3 miles. If you stay here and let me die, you'll have to survive the winter alone, and Flint will eventually kick that door in. You need me alive to guide you out of the Wind Rivers. And I need you alive so my ribs don't puncture my lung while I sleep." Josephine turned to face him, crossing her arms over the oversized canvas duster. "A truce, then?" "A bounty hunter, and his bounty." "A business arrangement," Gideon corrected. "You keep me breathing, chop the wood, and tend to Buster. When the storm breaks and I can sit a saddle without blacking out, I'll take you through the secret passes into Idaho. Caldwell's jurisdiction ends at the territory line. You'll be free. And your bounty? I reckon my ribs hurt too much to haul a stubborn woman back to Cheyenne." Gideon grunted, closing his eyes. For the next 4 days, the blizzard raged with apocalyptic fury. The cabin became a tiny, isolated universe of roaring wind, crackling fire, and the smell of boiling willow bark and coffee. Josephine worked tirelessly. She chopped firewood in the adjoining lean-to, fed and brushed the temperamental Buster, and changed Gideon's bandages. It was grueling, intimate work. As she unwrapped the linen bindings to inspect the bruising, her hands would inevitably brush against the scarred, muscular expanse of his chest. Gideon was a canvas of violence, knife scars from brawls, a puckered bullet wound on his left shoulder, and the deep, uneven claw marks of a cougar on his ribs. Yet, under her touch, the hardened mountain man remained perfectly still, his eyes tracking her every movement not with suspicion, but with a growing, quiet reverence. In the long, dark hours of the evening, the silence between them slowly thawed. Gideon spoke of his past, how he had been a scout for the cavalry, the things he had seen that made him retreat to the solitude of the high timber, finding more honesty in the harshness of the mountains than in the dealings of civilized men. Josephine told him of Texas. She spoke of the sprawling plains, the smell of sweetgrass, and the father who had taught her how to break a wild horse with a whisper instead of a whip. She spoke of Caldwell's suffocating grip, the gilded cage of his Cheyenne mansion, and the terror of her escape. "You should have killed him," Gideon said one night, his voice low over the crackle of the stove. "I thought about it," Josephine replied, staring into the flames. "But if I killed him, I would become him. I just wanted my freedom. Freedom in this country usually requires a little blood." "Josephine," Gideon murmured. By the 5th morning, the howling wind abruptly ceased. A profound, ringing silence fell over the mountains. The storm had broken, leaving behind a blindingly white, frozen world. Gideon forced himself out of bed. His right side was a canvas of deep purple and yellow bruises, and every step was a calculated agony. But the bones had stabilized. He strapped his heavy Colt to his hip and pulled on his spare coat. "We leave in an hour," Gideon said, watching Josephine pack the saddlebags. "The snow is deep, but Buster can break a trail to the western ridge. We'll have to ride double." Josephine nodded, securing the leather straps. But as she reached for her hat, Buster let out a sharp, panicked whinny from the corral outside. Gideon froze. He limped to the small frost-covered window and wiped away the condensation. At the edge of the tree line, 2 figures on horseback were struggling through the chest-deep snowdrifts, pushing toward the cabin. Even through the glare of the morning sun, Gideon recognized the heavy buffalo coats and the glint of badges. "Thaddeus Boone," Gideon swore softly. "And Josiah Flint. They must have been holed up in an abandoned mine shaft during the storm. They saw our smoke. Josephine's face drained of color. Do they know you have me? No. But Flint is a bloodhound. He'll want to search the cabin. Gideon turned to her, his jaw set. Get into the root cellar, under the floorboards by the stove. Do not come out, no matter what you hear. Gideon, they'll kill you if they find out you lied. Get in the hole, Josie, he hissed, using her nickname for the first time. Josephine scrambled to the floorboards, lifting the heavy iron ring. She slipped down into the dark, freezing earthen cellar, pulling the board shut just as heavy boots crunched onto the cabin's small wooden porch. Bang! 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 The heavy blows against the thick oak door rattled the hinges. Gideon took a deep breath, fighting the searing pain in his chest, and through the bolt, Deputy Marshal Thaddeus Boone stood on the threshold, a double-barreled shotgun resting casually in the crook of his arm. Behind him, standing in the snow, was Josiah Flint, a lean, rat-faced man with dead eyes and a pair of customized Schofield revolvers strapped low on his thighs. Callahan, Boone boomed, a false, hearty smile stretching across his frost-bitten face. By God, it's good to see a friendly face. Near froze our boots off waiting out that blow in the old copper mine. Boone, Gideon replied, leaning heavily against the doorframe to hide his grimace. What brings the law up to the timberline in the dead of winter? Hunting, Flint said. His voice was like dry leaves scraping over stone. He didn't look at Gideon. His dark eyes were scanning the corral, lingering on Buster, and then dropping to the snow on the porch, looking for a stray filly. Horace Caldwell's runaway bride. Haven't seen a soul, Gideon lied smoothly. Been laid up. Took a bad fall tracking elk. Broke 3 ribs. I'm just trying to stay warm. Boone chuckled. Well, that's a damn shame. Mind if we come in and warm our bones by that stove? Coffee smells mighty fine. I'm low on supplies, Thaddeus, Gideon said, blocking the doorway with his massive frame. And company makes me nervous. Flint stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the butt of his right Schofield. He looked down at the porch boards. You live alone, Callahan? You know I do. Then why? Flint asked, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Are there footprints from a size 6 riding boot stamped into the frost on your porch? The silence stretched, tighter than a piano wire. In a fraction of a second, the facade dropped. Flint's hand blurred as he drew his revolver. But Gideon, even broken and battered, was a creature of the frontier. He threw his weight to the left, shoulder-checking the heavy door directly into Boone's face. The heavy oak crunched into the deputy's nose, sending him staggering backward off the porch into the snow with a muffled cry. Flint's gun roared. The bullet splintered the doorframe inches from Gideon's head, sending wood shards biting into his cheek. Gideon drew his Colt, but the sudden, violent movement torqued his shattered ribs. A blinding flash of agony caused his arm to drop, his shot going wide and burying itself in the roof of the lean-to. Flint smiled, a cruel, cold expression, and cocked the hammer of his Schofield, aiming dead center at Gideon's chest. Caldwell pays double if she comes back alive, Callahan. He didn't say nothing about you. Click-clack. The distinct, metallic sound of a Winchester lever action being racked echoed from the shadows of the cabin. Flint's eyes widened. He shifted his aim toward the doorway, but he was a second too late. Josephine stood over the open root cellar, the heavy Winchester rifle nestled perfectly against her shoulder. Her blue eyes were ice cold, her hands perfectly steady. She didn't hesitate. She didn't offer a warning. She pulled the trigger. The rifle thundered in the confined space of the cabin. The heavy, 44-40 round caught Josiah Flint square in the right shoulder, spinning him violently in the snow. His gun discharged harmlessly into the sky as he collapsed, screaming in agony. Boone, wiping blood from his broken nose, looked from the fallen Pinkerton to the barrel of the Winchester now pointed directly at his own chest. "Drop it," Josephine commanded, stepping out onto the porch, her voice cutting through the freezing air like a whip. "Drop the shotgun, Marshal, or the next round goes through your throat." Boone swallowed hard. He looked at Gideon, who had recovered his stance, his Colt now trained steadily on the deputy. Slowly, deliberately, Boone let the shotgun fall into the snowdrifts. "You're making a mistake, girl," Boone sneered, holding his hands up. "You shoot a deputy marshal, you'll swing from a rope in Cheyenne." "I'm not going back to Cheyenne," Josephine said. She walked over to Flint, kicking his revolvers far into the snow, then turned to Gideon. "Tie them up. In the lean-to. Leave them enough wood for the stove so they don't freeze, but not enough to burn through the ropes." Gideon stared at her, utterly astounded. The society girl from Cheyenne had just outdrawn a Pinkerton killer and commanded a federal deputy. He holstered his weapon, fighting through the pain to fetch the heavy hemp rope from the corral. An hour later, Boone and a bandaged, groaning Flint were securely bound to the support beams of the woodshed. Gideon and Josephine led Buster out of the corral. The massive Mustang snorted, his breath pluming in the crisp air, seemingly eager to leave the bloodshed behind. Gideon painfully hoisted himself into the heavy McClellan saddle. He reached down, offering his large, calloused hand to Josephine. She looked at his hand, then up at his face. The hardened mountain man was gone. In his eyes, she saw respect, gratitude, and something far deeper, a quiet, burning devotion. She took his hand, and with a swift, practiced motion, swung up onto the horse behind him, wrapping her arms securely around his waist, mindful of his bandaged ribs. "Where to, Mr. Callahan?" Josephine whispered, resting her cheek against the heavy wool of his coat. Gideon looked out toward the towering, snow-capped peaks of the western ridge. The storm had passed. The sky was a brilliant, piercing blue, and the endless expanse of the frontier stretched out before them, wild and untamed. "We ride west, Josie," Gideon said, snapping the reins. "Idaho Territory, then maybe Oregon. Somewhere the snow melts, and the past can't follow." Buster surged forward, his powerful hooves breaking the pristine crust of the snow. They rode away from the blood, away from the bounties,